So continuing in my favorite water cooling cases series, this is going to be the fourth case in the series, and that's going to be the Fractal Design Meshify C Mini. Now, we covered the S2, which is the larger version, so let's talk about this smaller version and how it compares. Hey guys, Tiago with Classical Technology here. Thank you for joining me for another video. If you like my content, subscribe, smash that like button, leave a comment below. What type of water cooling case are you using? Alright, so on our last and our third favorite Fractal Design Meshify S2 water cooling case, we said how awesome it was. It looks really good. The performance was amazing. But Fractal Design also make a smaller version of it in the Meshify C Mini. Now, this is just going to have an mini-itx capability for your motherboard. You could always do the Fractal Design, the Meshify, that can do an ATX motherboard. It's a little bit taller. In general, I would probably recommend just doing that one. But I did do a build in the mini-itx version, which you're going to be a little bit more limited in your space, but it is smaller. Now, this case, there's a couple of caveats that we're going to talk about with it. Let's tackle this first on the basis of aesthetics, second, performance, and then third, the general build quality and other quirks that I had while building this case. So first, let's talk about aesthetics. Like the other Fractal Design cases, it's a very nice understated look. It's very clean. A lot of people like to build workstations in these. They're not like over the top with RGB or anything like that. They have a nice, elegant, professional look. Of course, the Define R6 in that series looks a little bit more workstation than this does. Because of the mesh panel, this does look a little more modern and a little more risque, but it's still a pretty, steadfast design, nothing too crazy, but I absolutely love these aesthetically. And generally, the mini-itx version, which is the Meshify C Mini, the benefit you're going to have here is that it's going to be smaller than the S2, by a pretty decent margin. You can only fit an mini-itx motherboard in here, but in terms of the aesthetics, I think when you do a water cooling loop in a small case like this, it looks even more impressive sometimes than a larger case, just because it's so much more difficult to get everything to nicely fit. Now, this is not going to be an easy case to build in. You're going to have to take a lot of decisions in terms of your aesthetics, where you're going to put your pump and your reservoir, what components you're going to use, what radiators you're going to use, because it doesn't fit everything like the S2 does, which is larger. So you're going to have to really plan this out before. First, let's talk about planning it out visually. Now, since you want to do water cooling in this case, most likely is generally really meant more for air cooling, but we can put water cooling in everything. Why not? It has the airflow. It does have the space for it, albeit it's very tight. You just have to remember you're going to have to use a small pump and reservoir in order to be able to fit. You may not be able to mount it vertically. You may have to mount it horizontally like I did here under the GPU in order to make everything fit. Some people also mount the pump, a small pump. You could use a DDC pump or a D5 pump. They mount it above the GPU, sort of in the back fan area. I kind of liked mounting it below the GPU just because then, I just felt a little more comfortable with it there. And just remember, when you fill this case, since it's mounted horizontally like that, I flip the case sort of on its back, so that way it's a vertical D5 pump and reservoir, and you fill it like a regular case and you get to bleed the air out, because if you try to fill it while it's on its side, it's just going to be so much more difficult. So I recommend flipping the case around just to make use of it almost as if it were vertical. Then you flip it back around, make sure everything's closed when everything's nice and full. Now, even with the front 240mm radiator and fans, I was still able to fit the GPU in here. In fact, I had a 2080 Ti in this case. So you can see, you can pack a lot of power in a small case like this, which is what makes it even more impressive. So everything fits in nicely. I even decided to use the thicker 16mm hard tubes for this case, just because I thought it would look even cooler having these thick tubes. Generally, thick tubes you'll use in larger cases, maybe small cases because of the space. Some people like to use smaller tubes, but I thought the large tubes would really fill out the space here, and aesthetically I think it came out really well, especially with the bends. So the case, although it's small, it does give you that view into a little window pretty much. When we're building a nice aesthetically pleasing water cooling design, you want it to be almost like a little TV set or a window into this beautiful little world, almost like an aquarium or something. You see the little fishies, swimming around. So it's really cool to have that, but in a smaller package, and that's why I think it looks even more more impressive. And for any of you that have built water cooling cases that are small like this, you know how hard it is. It's so much harder than a big build. So now let's talk about performance. Of course, since this is a micro-ATX case, it's a lot smaller. You're going to fit a lot less radiator space in here, so it's not going to perform as good or be as quiet as something like the Meshify S2. Now, I was able to fit a very thin radiator on the roof, a 240 millimeter, as well as a pretty slim radiator, 240 millimeter, once again, on the front, with some good fans. So that's more than enough space to have a water cooling build. It's not going to be the most efficient or overkill in your cooling of your components, but it did the job pretty nicely. Once again, in here I had a 2080 Ti as well as an X299 12-core CPU, so that's a lot of heat to cool, and it did it remarkably well. The GPU was going anywhere from 48C to maybe 52C under load, like let's say Heaven benchmark running for 20 minutes. It would generally be around 48 to 52C depending on the room ambient temperature, which is pretty good. In comparison, the Meshify S2 with its larger radiator space, more fans, and just more air flowing through the case would get maybe 42C to 44C in similar conditions. So you're definitely losing a few degrees by doing less radiators in a smaller case, but it is also significantly smaller. You can fit it in more places. It's not as wide or tall as the Meshify S2, and it does look, as we mentioned before, really impressive in a small build, doing so many cool components and water cooling parts. And for the third part, let's talk about a few more build notes and just build quality. Like the Meshify S2, the build quality is exceptionally good in this case. The front panel's a little flimsy, the way you sort of roll it up when you have to put the radiator in the front, and this is true of the S2 as well. If you're not careful, that front panel, there's no way to disconnect it. It's all the cables for the case. You have to sort of like roll it up like this, and it stands up there. I've had it come back down on my head when I was building a few times, which was a bit frustrating. It'd be nice if it could be completely detachable, or if it was like a door that just swung open. But of course, that's all really just a minor complaint. In general, if you're careful or you prop it up well enough, it's not going to come down on you, but just remember, be careful. I had it 2 or 3 times come down on my head and it really hurt. But aside from that, build quality is great. The mesh panel is great. Of course, it's not tempered glass or anything like that, but if you did have tempered glass, you would absolutely impede the airflow. So it's nice that it's a mesh panel so your performance stays good. Everything feels pretty high quality. This case, albeit it's a small case, you do have a lot of space, like we mentioned, for water cooling components, for some hard drives. So overall, the case lasted a long time without any issues, performs really great, and this is going to be for people that just really want a very small build that you can still put in a decent amount of water cooling hardware. Now, in general, if people want to do a smaller build than the S2, I may first recommend the regular Meshify C and not the Mini, just because it's so much more flexible, being able to fit an ATX motherboard instead of having to go to micro ATX, which you're going to have a less selection of motherboards, and if you upgrade the case in the future, you're kind of stuck with that smaller motherboard. So I would recommend the regular size Meshify C over the Mini. But if you really want to do the smallest build possible in this type of case, the Meshify C Mini is a fantastic choice. You're going to save a little bit of space with the height, so maybe you can fit it in certain places. And in my opinion, it being smaller than the Meshify, it does kind of make a difference aesthetically, just because it's so much harder to build a nice water cooling build in a small case like this. So when you see one done up really nicely, it is more impressive. If it was larger, it's not quite as impressive, just because, it's easier to build in it. It's easier to fit all those components. So it is kind of cool to build in a smaller one. But in general, I would recommend a little bit larger version. Alright guys, thank you very much for watching. Stay tuned for the next case in this series of my favorite water cooling cases. Leave a comment below, subscribe, smash that like button, and I'll see you guys on the next video.